Originally, I was planning on making a video reminding progressives why Biden is a terrible politician and explaining in detail why you shouldn't vote for him in the coming 2024 election. But one of my subscribers has awared me of a recent video uploaded by physicist YouTuber Sabine Hossenfelder that I simply could not ignore. In her video, Hossenfelder runs basic bitch Apologia for capitalism in an effort to drum up controversy and clicks as to maximize cash payments from her video sponsor. And though I have said this before, I'm going to say it again. It pains me how someone who is a master physicist, someone who knows how to emulate the earliest conditions of the Big Bang in an atom smasher, recreating particle forms and energy states that haven't existed since the literal beginning of time, but she can't take some time to understand how the system that she advocates actually works and touch up on even the basics of Marxist critique. Nope. Instead, we simply get Ischen von Microecon good, consumer choice good, capitalism good because penicillin, socialism bad because Cuba, carbon taxes solve climate change, Lemao. You would think that kind of genius-level intellect would translate well into subject matter pertaining to the humanities. After all, Einstein himself recognized the need for a socialist economy and lauded the USSR. And so we are here today to dispel these myths and so much more. Not only because it's easy content for my subscribers, but because this woman frequently speaks on topics outside of her area of expertise, and most of the time, when she does, she swings a miss. But because she's a decorated physicist, she's treated as an authority on these subject matter regardless. Starting off, she spends a good chunk of the beginning of her video explaining the emergence of fiat money. That money has value because we believe it has value, and effectively defining capitalism as free trade based on consensual contracts. She doesn't take any time to explain what value is, nor does she give a clearly defined explanation of what capitalism is, or how it actually works. Instead, she merely references Adam Smith's invisible hand and, much like Todd Howard, assures us that capitalism
just works.
So let's start off by defining what value is, what capitalism is, how capitalism actually works, and why capitalism is the root of all evil. For those of you not interested in the crash course in Marxist economics, feel free to skip ahead to any of the next timestamps. Otherwise, for those of you interested in learning what capitalism actually is and how the system works, feel free to stick around for this very dry, but otherwise very important summary of Marx's work. Value can be in reference to either use value or exchange value. Use value is contingent on the subjective needs of the individual, while exchange value is contingent on the labor imbued within all freely reproducible commodities that exist for wholesale on the market. This is the labor theory of value in a nutshell, that market equilibrium prices of a freely reproducible exchange value are equivalent to the average quantities of abstract human labor time imbued within said exchange values. The more human labor intensive the production of a good, the more valuable that good should be, and vice versa. Capitalism as we know it today is not defined by market economics or any of that other nebulous bullshit or mystical mumbo-jumbo in regards to free trade between consenting individuals. Nor is it defined by the existence of money or even private ownership of the means of production. For if it was, then you could define most social systems that have existed throughout history dating back for thousands of years as capitalist. Yet capitalism as we know it today has only been around for roughly 200 years. So then what is capitalism actually? It is an economic system defined by the contract of wage labor and large-scale commodity production, or what can better be described as generalized commodity production. When commodity production is generalized, goods and services are being mass-produced by the collective of a workforce employed by a firm, with each worker serving as a proverbial cog in a broader machine. Under such a context, the production of a given good cannot be attributed to the work of a single individual, since the production and distribution of said good was carried out in a systematic, industrialized context in conjunction with the collaborative efforts of everybody employed under the firm, from the miners and farmers that harvested the raw materials, to the workers running the foundries and refineries, to the manufacturers operating each step of the assembly line, to the engineers who maintain the machines, to the truck drivers delivering the final product, to the store clerks selling the products over the shelves. Under capitalism, two distinct classes of people form, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, aka the workers and the capitalists. Workers trade their labor time for a wage, while capitalists trade wage payments for the workers' labor time. During the working day, the capitalists effectively own the workers since they own their labor time, as the workers utilize tools and machinery, which is also owned by the capitalists, to produce goods and services, which are also owned by the capitalists, for wholesale on the market in the pursuit of maximizing profits, also owned by the capitalists. While workers spend their money to survive, capitalists spend money to make more money. And it is in the difference between the revenue generated from sales and the workers' wage payments, plus the cost of tools and machinery, where the surplus value, aka profits, are generated. During economic booms, when demand for industry is on the come up, capitalists are compelled to hire more workers and invest in more sophisticated technology in order to meet that demand and by extension securing increased revenue. In the process, since there's more demand for labor, the capitalists are compelled to hire more workers and to increase their wages and benefits as to steal them away from rival companies. Hurrah! Economic expansion takes place. New markets emerge. Everyone's making more money, capitalism works, progress moves forward, etc. And so as capitalism has developed, as firms in competition have outcompeted one another through advancing their industrial technology and shifting the organic composition of capital further and further in the direction of mechanization, less and less human labor is needed in order to manufacture their products. And so the cost of many non-inelastic goods such as clothing, radios, and television sets have been on the perpetual decline. This development is good for capitalism in the short term, since the more efficient companies can outproduce and outcompete the less efficient companies. Throughout this process, some firms go belly up, others grow and expand, and what you are left with is a market with fewer and fewer competitors with greater and greater sums of concentrated wealth over time. This is how capitalism has been a historically progressive force. It has brought us into the age of industrialization and economics of scale. It perpetually incentivizes the creation of new markets leading to an abundance of conveniences, services, and consumer goods. It has paved the way for the foundations of legal equality, and as time has gone on, it continuously generates the conditions necessary for its own abolition and the establishment of a new, humane socialist society. On the other hand, it is precisely because of the very same economic laws of motion of capital that have driven this social progress that this system is inherently prone to turbulence and economic crisis that are responsible for generating the vast majority of the waste, inefficiency, depravity, and inhumanity that we see in the world today. These crises take on multiple forms. Number 1, the crisis of overproduction. Since capitalists aren't producing in accordance to human need, but rather in accordance to the blind pursuit of profits, they have a habit of frequently overshooting actual market demand. When this happens, the economy enters a slump and industry enters a downturn. This is the traditional crisis of overproduction, which is said to happen every 7 to 10 years. Number 2, the crisis of automation. Since capitalists are compelled by the gaming mechanism to continuously automate to save on labor costs and production costs, what you are left with is growing reserves of unemployed people with no source of income with which to purchase the goods sold by the capitalists in the first place. Technological unemployment is a looming existential crisis that plagues capitalism, as the system is terminally compelled to outmode itself by providing humanity with the means to achieve a post-scarcity society over time. Number 3, the crisis of over-accumulation. In addition to the periodic recessions every 7 to 10 years, capitalism is also prone to enter periodic depression every 30 to 40 years, which is what occurs at the end of every accumulation cycle that capitalism undergoes. During these accumulation cycles, the market share becomes divided between a smaller and smaller number of larger and larger firms, leading to the development of monopolies, trusts, and cartels. This process of concentration and centralization of industry occurs due to a combination of mergers and acquisitions, as well as horizontal and vertical integration. At this stage, wealth production and transfer occurs vertically. As the mass of profits swells, the rate of profit declines. So while the capitalists are making greater and greater sums of total money over time, they are also making less and less relative to the upkeep costs of maintaining their giant, centralized monopolies and increasingly sophisticated manufacturing technology. Eventually, the accumulation cycle reaches its climax, when the rate of profit declines beneath the upkeep costs of industry, and the capitalists' continued investment no longer translates into greater sums of personal wealth for themselves. As a result, the capitalists cease their investment entirely, resulting in large swaths of industry shutting down, mass layoffs of employees, widespread bankruptcies and foreclosures, and the entire economy coming to a grinding halt. This is how you get depressions, which are set to occur at least twice to 3 times per century, from the Long Depression of the 1850s, to the 1873 stock panic, to the Great Depression of the 1930s, to the crisis of stagflation of the 1970s, to the Long Depression that we are well past due here in the 2020s. I recommend Henrik Grossman's book on the law of accumulation and breakdown for a more comprehensive understanding of this phenomenon. It is important to note that each and every time these crises occur, the capitalists are compelled to concoct increasingly abstract and barbaric schemes to restore profitability and get the economy going again. These methods have historically included, but are not limited to, the following. Number 1. Cutting wages and benefits, union busting, and/or firing all of your employees. Number 2. Privatization, or enclosure onto the commons. In order for capitalism to survive, it needs new markets to emerge, and one easy way to do this is to take publicly owned goods and utilities, things that really shouldn't be commodities, and transforming them into private services and commodities. Number 3. Government bailouts, tax cuts, subsidies, and corporate welfare paid for by the taxpayer. It's no secret that corporations such as Walmart and Amazon pay next to nothing in taxes when one factors for state subsidies. It is also no secret that the fossil fuel industry receives billions of dollars in subsidies from the US government for research and development every year. And every time these too-big-to-fail banks tank the economy, they're bailed out by the taxpayer as well to the tune of literally trillions of dollars. Number 4. Going to war. This has historically been a fantastic way to remobilize industry and jumpstart the economy, as the goal of this industry is to destroy a country and its infrastructure, and then proceed to go back in and rebuild it. I don't think it's a coincidence that America's prosperity following World War II coincided with the rest of the developed world being bombed back to the Stone Age. And so in a messed up way, war and conflict are actually good, at least economically, as the military-industrial complex makes a killing, no pun intended, as it is a massive driver of GDP and the creator of jobs. Number 5. Imperialist penetration and the domination of foreign economies. This is something that America and the Western European countries have been doing for centuries. When corporations grow large enough, they go transnational. When domestic markets have been fully tapped into, they seek to penetrate new markets abroad. And when they need labor and resources on the cheap, they turn to the third world, where the lion's share of the Earth's wealth and labor resides. Number 6. Deliberately shortening the durability and lifespan of manufactured products as to force consumers to have to periodically make repeat purchases of said products. This practice is known as planned obsolescence. For further reading, I recommend the pamphlet written in 1932 by Bernard London titled Ending the Depression Through Planned Obsolescence, where he discusses this concept in detail. Number 7. Straight-up embezzlement, fraud, wage theft, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, tax evasion, and/or looting the treasury. Not a lot of people know this, but most billionaires don't become billionaires through legitimate means, even by the standards of what this system deems legitimate. The truth is that pretty much all of the richest people on Earth are guilty of incredibly heinous crimes at the expense of the public. From the Panama Papers revealing how hundreds of thousands of private firms are actively engaging in widespread systematic tax evasion through the offshoring of their bank accounts, to Donald Trump's fake university scam, to the Bayer's pharmaceutical company knowingly selling medication infected with the AIDS virus to Asian and Latin American countries, to the subprime mortgage crisis where creditors were selling toxic mortgage packages that they knew were volatile before turning around and betting on those same packages to fail, to trillions of dollars of hard-earned taxpayer money mysteriously vanishing into thin air under the Bush administration. Believe me when I say that the list goes on and on and on and on and on. The reason for this is because in the grand scheme of things, capitalism truly doesn't have any rules. If it means maximizing profit, companies don't give a fuck. They will seize the opportunity at a moment's notice. And it is important to note that while they are doing this, that it is us, Regular working people, who are the ones who always end up suffering for it, despite the fact that it is the capitalists who are the ones in the driver's seat. Top-down control, bottom-up responsibility. In the blind pursuit of greater and greater profits and economic growth, the capitalist class externalizes more and more of the costs of their policies and reproduction schemes onto the public over time. They reap the benefits from all of our hard work, while we, regular working people, are the ones who are forced to pick up the tab for the fallout. And so once again, the overwhelming majority of the corruption, cruelty, fraud, depredation, poverty, ecological breakdown, and inhumanity that exists in the world today can be traced back as emergent properties of the capitalist system itself. As a result, class warfare is an inevitability. As living conditions grow increasingly intolerable for the average worker, the working class as a whole will be compelled and eventually forced into direct confrontation with the bourgeoisie. All one has to do is look at the last 200 years of the union movement, labor struggles, civil rights struggles, national liberation struggles, and socialist revolutions to see that our history is chiefly and primarily defined by class struggle. So I'm sorry to say, Ms. Hossenfelder, assuming you're not just making controversial clickbait content on behalf of your video sponsor, if you sincerely are pro-capitalist, then I'm afraid to say that means that you're in favor of a tiny minority of unelected, unchecked, unaccountable private oligarchs hoarding all of the wealth and power for themselves, while the general working population toils in misery, with little to no equity for themselves, despite being the class that produces everything which makes modern society as we know it possible, while said unelected, unchecked, unaccountable private oligarchs get away with robbing us blind, ruining our planet, destroying countless millions of lives, and quite literally raping children.
Scientists tend to associate the stunning societal progress we've seen since then to science and technology, but I think that's having it backwards. The driver of all this progress was the capitalist system that allowed an efficient allocation of resources. By resources, I don't just mean raw materials, but also goods and human resources. Capitalism is a system that distributes these resources without anyone needing to have an overview, just by interactions between traders. It's pure genius if you think about it. And free markets are a beautiful example of decentralized self-organization, an invisible hand, as Adam Smith put it. The way it works in a nutshell is that everyone can trade around until they've got what they think is the best combination of goods, services, and financial assets.
There is so much bullshit packed into these statements alone that I don't even know where to begin. I guess I will just go point by point. First, that capitalism drives scientific innovation. Second is that it distributes resources in the most efficient fashion. And third, that it does so based on consensual choices being made by rational economic actors. Starting with the point on scientific innovation. Does capitalism drive innovation? Only if it is profitable to do so, and even when it is, they prefer to leave it up to the government so that the taxpayer foots the bill and takes on the risk, so the capitalists don't have to. Liberals often invoke the smartphone as evidence of capitalist innovation, and yet all of the technology that goes into our smartphones, from the lithium battery to the touchscreen interface and so on, is based primarily on military research. All private companies like Apple have done was take this technology, compile it into the mobile phone, patent it, and then sell it back to consumers. Another example comes from the US National Institute of Health, which spends roughly $30 billion per year on pharmaceutical research and the development of biotechnology. Most of our medications and treatments for disease come straight from government research. All private pharmaceutical companies have done is taken these medications, manufactured derivatives of them, and then selling this medication to sick and dying people at exorbitant costs. Then there's space exploration. Virtually every time that massive breakthroughs have been made in space science and technology, the benefits have almost always resulted in a net boost in overall societal wealth, as many of our recent scientific innovations either came directly from, if not were inspired directly by, space agency research. From medical technology, to bioengineering, to jet propulsion, to rebreathers, to 3D printing, to firefighting technology, to new methods of water purification, to our natural disaster response, etc. While it is true that capitalism is what kicked off the Industrial Revolution, and private firms have invented plenty of technology on their own, the majority of our scientific developments have come from publicly funded research in the military, space agencies, and universities. Capitalism is merely the system by which said technological advancements are distributed back to consumers. But if most of this technology and innovation is being paid for by publicly funded institutions, shouldn't the fruits of those innovations go directly to the benefits of the public? Why do we need these greedy middlemen coming along and effectively privatizing these advances and then hoarding most, if not all, of the wealth generated by these scientific gains for themselves, despite it coming directly from our tax dollars? Again, they're not the ones paying for this research. We are. And yet we still have to pay for exorbitant markups every step of the way, be it for overpriced pharmaceutical medication, planned obsolescent smartphones, marked up internet and phone bills, electric cars, etc. But for the sake of thought exercise, let us slow down for a moment and grant this point some undue credence. Let us assume for a moment that capitalism really was responsible for all of this scientific innovation from both a developmental and distributive standpoint. Even if that were true, that we really did have capitalism to thank for everything, capitalism is not the only system capable of driving scientific innovation and distributing advanced technology to consumers. Publicly owned institutions are just as, if not even more capable of researching and developing technology and distributing the fruits of said technology to the general public just fine. The Soviet Union produced some of the most brilliant minds of our time, whose works and contributions to the realm of human knowledge are still very much relevant to this day. Figures such as Nikolai Kardashev, Alexei Abriskov, Igor Kurchatov, and Leonid Kantorovich. The Soviet Union's state-led research bureaus pioneered the first rocket ships, space stations, spacesuits, satellite technology, nuclear power plants, computers, cell phones, new vaccines, new medical technology, as well as a slew of military tech to go along with it. To this day, many of our satellites, rockets, and spacesuits are based off of Soviet designs. But what happens when advancing technology not only yields no profits, but actively undermines the profits of and threatens the establishment of a given industry? A few examples. Electrically powered transportation has existed for over a century, from battery-powered cars and trains and trolleys. Many cities in the US used to have a robust public transit system, but now, in the blind pursuit of profits, the politicians and business folk have opted to transform our mass public transit into a private service. Cities were bulldozed and rebuilt, highways and vast parking lots were paved, and our mass transit system has been castrated. Now, in order to get around in America, one must purchase a private automobile powered by the internal combustion engine. You might think this is a step forward, but I think any rational human can agree that from a sustainability standpoint, this was a colossal step backwards. Cars are the least efficient, least environmentally friendly, most expensive, most dangerous, and most ecocidal form of transportation when compared to the alternatives. And yet, this is the direction that capitalists have knowingly pushed us in, despite the fact that the fossil fuel industry has known about climate change for decades. Now, if we seek to climb out of this hole that we have dug ourselves in, it will entail giving America's power grid and transportation infrastructure a complete makeover, which will require huge amounts of public volunteering and state intervention in the economy, something the capitalists will actively fight against to their dying breath. How about cures for diseases? There's far more incentive under this system to treat sickness as opposed to curing it, because in curing the disease, you get a person to pay once. In treating the disease, you get them to pay repeatedly for years to come. Do you have any idea what it would do to the economy if diseases were actually cured and prevented? And with this in mind, with the medical industry being a huge driver of GDP as well, does it really seem like the goal of the medical establishment is to cure or to simply treat these ailments? If the medical establishment was in the business of finding cures, then the medical establishment would be in the business of putting themselves out of business. Not to mention the fact that there is a colossal slew of other technology that exists today and has existed for a long while that would solve mountains of problems that simply aren't being utilized or put in place. From thorium molten salt reactors, to desalinization plants, to vertical crop towers, to lab-grown meat, to maglev bullet trains and electrically powered transportation, to sodium-ion batteries, etc. This is all technology that exists, that could be utilized to resolve climate change, water scarcity, food scarcity, and the energy crisis as we know it. And yet it is being stifled and held back by the short-sighted, for-profit system that you're vocally supporting your favor of, Mrs. Hossenfelder. Let's talk about the point in regards to economic efficiency, because what capitalism deems efficient is not the same as what actually is efficient from a truly scientific, pro-ecological, pro-human standpoint. What capitalism considers efficient is whatever results in the maximization of profits, which, as I am about to demonstrate, has absolutely fuck all to do with truly rational resource allocation. Here in the United States, under the private health insurance industry, we pay more for our healthcare services than any other nation on the planet, and yet our system yields demonstrably lower life expectancy and worse healthcare outcomes across the board. We spend more for our medications than anybody else on Earth. Medical debt is the #1 cause of bankruptcy here in the United States. And to top it all off, 40,000 people die every single year from preventable illness due to lack of access to healthcare. How about homelessness? There are an estimated 500,000 homeless people in the United States at any given time, according to official statistics. Realistically, this number is likely much higher than the documented amount, but that's not important. For every homeless American, there is nearly 30 vacant homes that they could be dwelling in. In what world is this an efficient distribution of resources, Mrs. Hossenfelder? What about planned obsolescence? A practice which we briefly touched up on earlier, by which companies manufacture their products deliberately faulty and inferior on the spot as to force consumers to eventually return and make a repeat purchase. Companies like Apple strategize their planned obsolescence by deliberately making it difficult to repair and service their old products, while developing their next several generations of iPhones that they plan on releasing to the public every other year. Nothing in this system is truly built to last, as the giant seas of landfills full of faultily produced crap that span the countryside is the testimony to this fact. What is economically efficient about indirectly forcing consumers to buy the same product over and over again, and then tossing out the old ones to rot away in landfills? How about global poverty and inequality? COVID-19 is another good example. Despite the fact that poor countries are the ones that need COVID vaccines the most right now, patent laws prevents them from being able to manufacture their own. And then there's the question of food scarcity. We produce enough food to feed 10 billion people globally, and yet roughly 1 in 7 people on Earth is chronically malnourished, while half of the food that we produce never reaches a human mouth. Most of the human population lives in abject poverty, while the imperialist First World, constituting 14% of the human population, own and control over 80% of its wealth. Tens of millions of people die every single year due to preventable starvation and sickness. Again, they're not dying due to the lack of available food or medicine, they're dying because of the lack of available access. Mind you, this is happening in a world where, at the same time, the top 26 richest human beings possess for themselves more wealth than the bottom half of humanity. Mrs. Hossenfelder, in what world is a tiny sliver of the population hoarding everything while everybody else has virtually nothing for themselves a rational distribution of resources? You speak of free choice between rational actors. What choice does a homeless, unemployed person who cannot get a job have? What choice do the millions of people starving to death or dying of preventable illness at this very moment have? Should they have just worked harder? What about enclosures? An ongoing process that has been occurring over the globe for centuries. What choice did the feudal Korean peasantry have when the Japanese investors and landlords broke up their communities and forced them off of their ancestral land at gunpoint? What choice did the Soviet people have when Boris Yeltsin ruled as dictator of Russia and forcibly broke up the USSR against their consent, shoving neoliberal austerity down their throat and threatening to unleash the army on them if they dared try and resist? What choice did the Palestinians have when the Israeli settlers dropped their fascist ethno-state on top of their country, despite the fact that Palestine was an internationally recognized sovereign nation? What about all the democratic governments that the US has toppled in CIA-backed coups and assassinations? What choice do the people of Latin America have when their governments get overthrown by fascists and their country is subsequently ruined and plunged into chaos shortly thereafter?
Capitalism got a pretty bad rep when Marx claimed that it's just about grabbing hold of the means of production and exploiting the working class. Of course, there was an element of truth to his fears, because some things went badly wrong during the Industrial Revolution, but that's another story.
You're showing your ignorance again. There was a great deal more than an element of truth to Marx's critique and analysis of capitalist political economy, and as I have thoroughly demonstrated thus far, it is about so much more than simply who owns the means of production. Karl Marx described this system's modus operandi to a T, building upon the observations of Adam Smith and Dave Ricardo, and utilizing their established works to expose how fundamentally ugly and broken that this system actually is. What Marx did was the equivalent of using the Bible to prove that Christianity is wrong and that God doesn't exist. As a result, Karl Marx isn't just some guy who said capitalism is bad 200 years ago. He is one of the most influential thinkers of the modern era. His work has inspired countless economists, activists, politicians, philosophers, revolutionaries, and freedom fighters across the globe. And on top of that, he's considered by many, along with his partner Friedrich Engels, to be the founding father of the study of human behavior that is sociology as we know it. And capitalism didn't just do bad things at its inception. It did terrible, horrific, nightmarish, ecocidal, infanticidal, anti-human, Twilight Zone, Friday the 13th doesn't even make any sense type shit. When the capitalist epoch first emerged, it turned the entire world as we knew it then upside down. Yes, it kicked off the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Yes, it was a force for progress. It also made life absolutely fucking miserable for the vast majority of the population, where every member of the family, every man, woman, and child had to work 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 to 7 days per week, for pennies an hour, in dangerous, hazardous, and unsanitary working conditions with no paid days off, no benefits or protections to speak of. There's a reason why the history of the labor movement, civil rights movement, and national liberation movements abroad have been characterized by massive amounts of turmoil and bloodshed. And these struggles are ongoing to this day. To attribute all of our social progress thus far exclusively to capitalism is an egregious distortion of the history that completely omits the astronomical amounts of class struggle and relentless self-sacrifice for the greater good that has brought us the 8-hour day, employee benefits, livable wages, the social safety net, and what legal equality and protections that we have in the first place. These things were not simply given to us. We had to fight for them. Fun fact. The fastest plummet in the duration of the average work week in human history occurred immediately after the October Revolution in Russia, when the communists had successfully seized state power for the first time. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
For today, we just need to know that capitalism, like fiat money, requires a governing institution. That's because someone must be there to enforce contracts, should the need arise. That and a few other things, as we'll see in a moment. There are many different ways to govern a capitalist system, and they go by different names like welfare capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism, or state capitalism. Now, one can debate how well the actions of certain governments reflect the interests of their electorate, if they were elected in the first place, but that's another story. Even so, capitalism has been enormously successful in unlocking societal progress, and the nations who still don't use it, such as North Korea, Cuba, and Laos, are places you don't want to live. And the nations who still don't use it, such as North Korea, Cuba, and Laos, are places you don't want to live.
Pause. Let's get something straight. The Western countries are rich because 1. They have had over a century head start to industrialize over the rest of the world, and 2. Have been the benefactors of over 5 centuries of colonialism and imperialist economic relations that are ongoing to this day. Every year, trillions of dollars in value are being transferred from the poor countries to the rich countries through policies of unequal exchange, foreign direct investments, tariffs, taxation, sky-high interest rates, and in some instances, outright military plunder. And so the wealthy capitalist countries of the West owe quite literally everything that they have to the labor and resources that they've expropriated and continue to expropriate from the second and third world to this day. Within the last 100 years, there hasn't been one country that has tried to break away from the colonial imperialist world order, that has attempted to realize its own self-determination, that has went off to nationalize its industry, and attempted to utilize its own domestic wealth and labor to enrich its own domestic population on its own terms, that hasn't in some way, shape, or form been relentlessly fucked with by the United States or its Western allies. All one has to do is look at the lengthy history of the US government's involvement in regime change and military interventions to bear witness to this fact. The reason why Cuba and North Korea are as poor as they are and why life is as difficult as it is in those countries has nothing to do with the fact that they are socialist, and everything to do with the fact that they are both very small, geographically restricted, third world nations that are in the process of being deliberately sabotaged by the United States with its genocidal economic warfare. Through the use of its dollar hegemony, it has imposed the harshest sanctions in the history of sanctions on Cuba and the DPRK. And by the US government's very own admission, the purpose of these sanctions is to make their people so impoverished and miserable that they are compelled to overthrow their own governments. It is worth noting that despite the ongoing economic warfare against these two countries, that Cuba and North Korea boast higher human development indexes than many of their liberated capitalist neighbors. Just look at how Cuba squares up against Haiti, for example, or how the DPRK squares up to Nepal. When put up to countries of similar geography, population sizes, starting conditions, and economic parity, despite actively being undermined and sabotaged by the most powerful empire in human history, look what they are able to accomplish with what limited resources that they have. Every country that has had a socialist or communist revolution in the last century has been infinitely better off for it than had they remained capitalist. Russia went from a backward, semi-feudal, agrarian peasant backwater to an industrial superpower practically overnight. China experienced much of the same, going from one of the poorest countries on earth, being an even more backward, outright feudalist, agrarian peasant backwater, to currently being on the path to being the world's #1 superpower. Cuba was a Western sugar colony run by gangsters and the mob before socialism. Korea was a Japanese colony, being brutally exploited and abused prior to socialism. The Eastern European countries were ran by fascist dictatorships. East Germany was ran by literal Nazis. These countries were fucking nothing before socialism. Socialism had the Eastern European economies growing linearly, boom-bust free for decades, and the restoration of capitalism in these countries resulted in a massive economic crash, the immediate impoverishment and immiseration of hundreds of millions of people, a drop in life expectancy, a drop in fertility rates that has yet to recover to this day, a spike in income inequality, and the proliferation of crime, drug abuse, and human trafficking. I recommend the study Socialism, Capitalism, and the Physical Quality of Life for those of you who want more hard evidence. When compared to capitalist countries of similar geography, starting conditions, and developmental levels, in virtually every instance, the socialist regimes outperform their capitalist counterparts by every measurable metric across the board.
Suppose there's a river going by your house that everyone is free to use. One day a clothing company puts up a factory and dumps their toxic waste into the river. Or the fish die and no one dares swimming in the river anymore. This is clearly not an optimal use of resources, you might say. Why didn't Smith's invisible hand prevent it? The reason market forces didn't prevent it is that the water was free to use. The market didn't know it had any value, so pollution couldn't reduce its value. There are several ways to deal with problems like this. One is to just pass laws that forbid certain actions and punish those who disobey.
And notice how government's regulations on the market have stopped all pollution, economic crises, and solved climate change. Oh wait.
The current situation is that companies who voluntarily produce environmentally friendly goods put themselves at a competitive disadvantage because other companies exploit the environment at zero cost. This moves the burden onto the consumer. If you want to buy a climate-friendly product today, you face extra costs because fossil fuels are cheap and getting to net zero is not. This makes no economic sense and it'll ultimately not work. It's completely upside down. Products whose production causes damage to the environment, which then requires adaptation and mitigation, should be more expensive, not less expensive. This is why economists have argued for decades that we need to put a price on carbon, and it's why several countries have now introduced carbon taxes or use a cap-and-trade system. To calculate the cost of carbon emissions, one basically needs to evaluate the damage the emissions would cause in the future and then put a price on them. It's called the social cost of carbon.
Is she really suggesting that a carbon tax is all that we need in order to steer our economies away from fossil fuels? Really? Raising taxes on consumers, and not sweeping, systematic, centrally planned efforts on the part of governments and the public across the world to actively overhaul our infrastructure and energy grids to carbon-neutral renewables? The inconvenient truth that liberals really need to come to terms with is that there is no money in solving climate change or the ecological crisis. As a matter of fact, there is no money in solving any of the issues plaguing humanity at this time. In a UN study published not too long ago, they looked at a number of industries and calculated what it would cost to fix the damage that they inflict onto our ecosystems. And what they found was that if we were to force these industries to pay for the damage that they externalize onto our earthly habitats, that we would be effectively bankrupting virtually every single industry on Earth. In other words, capitalism quite literally cannot be environmentally sustainable. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Our whole system's ethos is infinite growth and consumption on a finite planet with finite resources. For us to scale back on our consumption rates would entail the shrinking of GDP and the reduction of wages and jobs, which is the exact opposite of what capitalism needs in order to function. There's a reason why world governments keep failing repeatedly to meet their environmental sustainability targets with respect to curbing biodiversity loss and carbon footprint. And that is because capitalism demands infinite growth, and you can't grow an economy by not using or consuming resources. It's incredibly silly and naive to think that we can simply tax our way out of this mess, when the true solution to climate change and the environmental crisis will necessitate a fundamental shift in the world economic order as we know it, towards a planned socialist economy that produces in accordance to human need while sustaining a balanced load with our earthly habitat. And in order to bring forth this new economic paradigm, it will by design necessitate a global proletarian revolution, by which the working class seize control of the means of production and usurp the ruling capitalist order. Whether you like it or not, this is the true solution to climate change, and there are no excuses for why we can't do this now. We are living in an era where we can split the atom and communicate with one another across the globe at light speed. For the first time in human history, we now have the science and technology, as well as the creative and hard-working labor of the general population to make this dream a reality. Not only could socialism solve all of the problems facing us today while ushering forth a new renaissance of human freedom and prosperity, but all present evidence seems to suggest that socialism is the only viable path forward at this point for the sake of our survival. It's a win-win situation as well. We have nothing to lose but the world to gain. The time has come for us as a species to evolve. We've had our fun with the capitalist system while it lasted. We've had our growth and our boom in science and technology. The rich have enjoyed well over 2 centuries of playtime on their playground with their toys. But now it's time for us as a species to grow out of our infancy and start acting like adults, and to take social responsibility for ourselves, for each other, and our planet. After all, we only live once, and this is the only planet that we have. Unfortunately, Sabine Hossenfelder has absolutely nothing for us in the realm of this discussion. She makes a lot of assumptions that she treats as objective facts and expects us to accept at face value. She features no evidence or works cited in her video description to back up any of her claims. She espouses meaningless platitudes and out-of-touch free market orthodoxy that sounds like it reads straight from a first-semester microeconomics college book. And her solutions are so short-sighted and in the box that it completely downplays the true severity of the situation. Consciously or not, she's basically spreading misinformation and pro-billionaire propaganda at the behest of her YouTube sponsors for easy clout and money. On the other hand, the scientific professions as we know them today are based on the pursuit of the objective demonstrable truth and observable reality. But what Mrs. Hossenfelder has done in the creation of this video is the exact reverse opposite of being a scientist. Instead, she is being a propagandist. She is being a politician. She's being an unprincipled charlatan. She is in fact being a pro-billionaire shill. Some advice, Mrs. Hossenfelder, for the future. Next time, why don't you stay in your lane making pop science videos on astrophysics and particle physics and leave the study of political econ to Marxists such as myself? Because clearly this subject is not your strong suit, and it would be better for you to remain silent on these questions over espousing a bunch of ignorant nonsense as though your physics background makes you an authority by default. In doing so, you only mislead people, and in the eyes of the initiated, make yourself look like a fool. No investigation, no right to speak, and you clearly haven't investigated this subject at all, so remember to stay in your lane. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for tuning in.